this is a little different, but I think I'm generally a little different, so it kind of fits. I have no slides, except two that Bob made for me. And I'm just going to talk for 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'm going to ask you to reflect and talk to each other, which is, I think, a good choice on my part. And the other different thing is that the 3 subjects I'm talking about are things that I don't hear a lot, except maybe in this conference. Climate change, maybe calling it climate catastrophe. Inequality, which is very woven into the fabric of STIA, but not out there much. And morality and ethics, which I know is very old-fashioned, and it contains within it a lot of the baggage of the far, should we say, right side of the polarity with authority and judgment and so forth. But yet what I've discovered in talking about things like moral injury and a systemic ethics, which I won't talk about today, but I have talked about, is that it's a language that people can relate to, whether you're a veteran, someone in the Tea Party, someone who's, people like us, us kind of, I think we can almost handle it. I mean, you kind of want to say, well, that's not really morality and ethics. That's like, we're telling our story, or, it's our culture, Well, I'm going to try and use this language and just see how it works on you guys. Okay. So, my motivation, my fear and love, is that I have 4 granddaughters and a grandson soon. And I believe that the world that I am bestowing them as best I can tell at 71 years old is not a world that in 20, 40, 60 years from now will be at all like we know our world to be, and it will also contain a far more of the disruption and inequality and stressors than we've ever seen before. It doesn't mean we couldn't change that, but that is, stay the course, this is what's going to happen. And for that, I choke up when I say that. For that, I feel deeply ashamed. And it's because I've known this for a long time. And, I was privileged enough to know about this in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so forth. And I'm still not seeing that even my efforts can make a difference. And that's kind of the definition of moral injury, which I'll tell you a lot more about. That's all I'm going to really talk about until it's time for you to talk. But the definition is some complicity that I have with a system that's causing great harm to others, and that I feel, whether it's passive or frozen, or I'm in over my head, or I don't know what to do, the structures won't let me, I feel I'm unable to do anything about it. And it's, and my thesis is that we all have that to some extent. And that, so I'll tell you a little bit about what's being done in the VA with using moral injury as the new language, and as opposed to not discounting the terrible traumas of PTSD, but finding that what's really the long-term damage that causes people to shut down, feel suicidal, give up, and so forth, is coming actually from their goodness as a human being. and that goodness, whether it's a parent who, and I'd love to find out what you're finding in, dealing in our community war zones. But it's the goodness of the parent or the soldier or whatever who actually has moral standards, that people do have them. It's a very small percentage that doesn't. Anyway, I wanted to talk about a couple things on the way to getting you to talk about this. And one of them is that this is a big week in climate science, in that the UN Climate Study Group came out with its report, which is Chapter 3, which is what do we do about climate, the climate catastrophe oncoming. And of course, they say no one's going to be untouched. And second, they say, and I haven't read it, it's only 26 pages long, which is astounding. We'll be able to read it. But I just read about what it was going to say. And second, obviously, all the systems that we're embedded in, economics, food, energy, so forth, need revolutionary change. That was the word that I read. And, but of course, I think this group particularly knows it's the revolutionary change begins with the hearts in the communities and the local living economies and the empowerment of people to make a difference. So in any event, that's kind of chilling, but real. And my burning question is, and the one I'm going to hope that we can engage in a little bit collectively, is how do we get engagement? If I'm kind of wounded by my inability to do anything, and I got a lot going for me that most people don't, in terms of these issues of awareness and access to, making change. How are we going to get people engaged? And I think it's really simple. I think it's exactly what we're doing in this conference. But I think a little more about what they're doing in the VA would be interesting. So I'm going to rely on my notes a little bit for that. There's a woman called Carolyn Raffensperger who talks about the moral injuries of climate change with our complicity in the massive tragedies, and calls it an injury to the soul, which is another way of saying it. But what the VA is doing is that they're finding a lot of the damage is not fear-based, but rather shame and grief, and beginning with people's not facing the consequence of their actions, particularly when you allow harm to befall on somebody else. And there you get the guilt and shame. And there's this Dr. Shea from the VA that you can Google his YouTubes. It's very interesting to watch him, where he talks about moral injury as a shrinking of the moral and social horizon. Passivity, numbness, not caring. And this is where I wonder if it's not happening more widely in the US. Our complicity in the growing inequality, the stealing of the future of our grandchildren, is our own shrinking moral and social horizon. And when the moral horizon shrinks, the VA doctor says, so do the person's ideals and their attachments and their ambitions. So what to do when working with vets? They put the vets together in peer groups and have them talk about how they're feeling, what they did, begin to be able to acknowledge what's really, really traumatized them in their own anxious actions or lack of actions, find a kind of mutuality in their forgiveness, and then get them into action. And you've read all the stories of groups of vets who are out doing things, and that's the healing. And I do believe as many of the people, starting with the Cincinnati group, called for in this thing, that's our healing too. So now I do have a couple of questions for you. And they're going to come up on my 2 slides that Bob Stilger made on his cell phone. And what we're going to do, we're going to reflect for a minute, and then we're going to get in pairs and talk to both of them. And I'll tell you both questions. This is the first one. Remember a time when you experienced something like a moral injury. You can, do what you want with that. And how did you heal? And the second question will be, how did you support others who were in this situation? And then how did you show up? And that will come up. So how about we take a minute to just think about that, and I'll be totally quiet. And then, in the interest of rolling along in time, would you find a single other person, and we'll each talk 2 minutes rather than 3. So is that about right for our timing? And so try not to get a triad. What's that? Triad. Try not to get a triad if you can help it, because then you won't have much time to talk. And do the first question and first question for a minute and a first question back in a minute, and then we'll do the second question. Okay, so find someone and start jabbering, please.